So I just finished chapter 1. I think I'm just going to go through page by page and talk about my thoughts on it. Starts off talking about how everyone seeks happiness, and I get that, but he starts to kind of, in some sense, conflate happiness and joy. And this is actually a conversation I had with my little brother the other day on how we as Christians, we have our different definitions of joy and happiness and how they're different. And my little brother he was essentially challenging that, and something I'm wanting to look into, but I don't have time at the moment. There's like some weird lights here. I think it's just the reflection of, it's just the reflection of my... I'm gonna go turn that down. He does get into the idea of heaven being people floating on a cloud and strumming a harp, and how this sounds terribly boring. He's not wrong. I mean, I think that is a bad view of heaven that we can have sometimes. But he gets into things, and I'm just not sure the things I can necessarily stand by. I am hesitant to call heaven boring. I don't think it would be a place like that. The thing is, though, I guess just talking to it, one of the main problems I have with this idea of heaven being a physical place is when you really get down to it, I feel like it's saying God's not enough, and that we require the material things for a place like heaven to be worth it. And that's why I feel that this is a dangerous thought process to go down, because when we require the things of the world for us to be happy, it's very materialistic. It's very self-centered. And he goes into talking about how people were talking about heaven up until this generation. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with. And I'm wondering if that's possibly due to the fact that we've become more materialistic and we've become more about the things of this world. It seems like that to me. I don't want to have to require the TV over there that's in my apartment just to go to heaven, because if we really need that, we're saying God's not enough for us. I want to be okay with the idea of heaven being just God, because that's where I want my heart to be. I don't want my heart to be here in the world. I want it to be focused on spiritual things, heavenly things. He has a saying where he's saying, on page 7, it says, trying to develop an appetite for disembodied existence in a non-physical heaven is like trying to develop an appetite for gravel. And it is kind of funny just kind of think of it that way, but the way I'd kind of come back with how it is, trying to explain what a spiritual heaven is even like is like trying to explain what the number 4 tastes like. And that's not even completely a ridiculous saying. I heard back in college about a thing called synesthesia, where colors can have tastes to them, or numbers can have sounds and things like that. It's hard to wrap your mind around something like that without actually being in that experience. And in the same way, I don't think we can really understand what a spiritual heaven would even look like in our physical bodies. There's a book, I think it's called Cube World, talks about the idea if you lived in a 2D plane, the idea of a third dimension would make no sense to you. It would be like, what is up? That doesn't make any sense. And he goes into other things like saying what a sphere would look like if it went through, and other things like that. But similar sense, I don't think we as physical beings can even understand what a spiritual heaven looks like. And onto his section on page 8 talking about the theological neglect of heaven. He seems to imply that we just don't hear about it nowadays. And I heard about it. I mean, I went through a Bible study on Revelation a few years ago. Forget exactly when it was. And now my church is going through Revelation right now. I don't know if that's a thing with book being a little old. He doesn't really back it up with statistics is my main problem. He can say it, and you're like, okay, you're saying it, but it's all anecdotal, nothing solid. Yeah, this is in 2004. He's just talking about the different books and how they have very little to talk about on heaven. And yeah, I'll give him that. If there's not a lot on it, there's not a lot on it. I mean, obviously he wrote one, which, as you know, I have problems with. He then goes into something that I think is just a little bit petty. I know, me talking about petty. He goes into kind of, not necessarily attacking Bible colleges, but really getting annoyed at Bible colleges for not talking about heaven, even though he gives a legitimate reason as to why they're not talking about it. It says in page 9, heaven suffers as a subject precisely because it comes last, not only in theological works, but in seminary and in Bible college classrooms. Teachers often get behind in their eschatology classes, enmeshed in different views of hell, Israel and the church, the tribulation, and the millennium. No time is left for discussing the new heavens and the new earth. To that I have to say, doesn't mean they don't want to talk about it. It just means they can't talk about it. I went into an electricity and magnetism class where we never talked about waveguides. They were pretty important. Apparently I've never used them since, but it doesn't mean that we didn't want to talk about them or that we wanted to kind of push them to the side and not get into it. Just means they didn't get covered. It happens. It's college. Teachers are people too. They have time. They don't have all the time. If they did, I'm sure they'd love to talk about it. And he kind of goes into a straw man with comparing it to going to Mars but not knowing anything about Mars. I think conflating those two things is a bit disingenuous. Then he gets into a section called Where Do We Get Our Misconceptions? Saying it's from Satan. And yeah, does Satan make sure that the teachers never have time at the end of class? I'm just saying how Satan forcibly evicted from heaven and now wants to make sure people don't necessarily want to go there. And yeah, that's a fair assumption. I'd say it's a safe assumption where we get that false assumption of just laying on clouds playing harps. And then he gets to the one thing that I just kind of felt ironic. In a section called Resisting Naturalism's Spell, going in about a section on the silver chair, he goes into it as being attack against naturalism. I kind of viewed it as an interesting reverse take on Plato's allegory of the cave, but I haven't read the book, so I'm not sure that's a fair assumption. He goes on to define naturalism as the belief that the world can be understood in scientific terms without recourse to spiritual or supernatural explanations. Which, okay, yeah, I agree, we don't want to be like that. But then he goes on to say, on page 13, the truth is exactly the opposite of naturalism's premise. And heaven isn't an extrapolation of earthly things. Earth is an extension of heaven, made by the Creator King. And I agree. I mean, even talks about it in Hebrews. In Hebrews 10:23, it's talking about the first covenant, everything had to be inaugurated with blood and covered with blood, and then in verse 23 it says, therefore it was necessary for copies of the things in heaven to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves to be purified with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, only a model of the true one, but into heaven itself, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. It's the idea in philosophy of telos, where you have the idea of something and then you get everything from it. So like the telos of a chair, you have this idea of a chair, and from there you can get actual chairs, like the banana chair I have right there, the desk chair, the kitchen chair, different things like that. You can say a rock has in some form the telos of a chair, if I'm using the word correctly. I would say this is kind of exactly what I was saying. The problem I have with this, the idea of the earth is not necessarily an extension of heaven, but it's the image of it. And in that sense, I don't think because of that it is physical. Depending on his definition of physical, I'm only in chapter 1. I think when we look at the earth, we should look at it as a shadow of heaven, not actually heaven. So because of that, I don't think we should be looking at the physical things as necessarily something that will be there, because they're shadows of things will be there. Now, he'll probably go into that more later, but I think that's the main difference I have with him, is that there. So yeah, that's my thoughts on chapter 1. I'm only in chapter 1. It's possible that he'll explain things in a better way than I have seen them now, but that's my thoughts on it now. In summary, I don't want to be attached to this world in a way that makes me not want heaven. In that sense, yeah, like you wouldn't want to go in a heaven where you're just sitting on a cloud strumming a harp, because yeah, that does sound boring to us in our physical desires. But at the same point, I want to be able to say that heaven is just me and God hanging out, and that's good enough, because that's what he wants. He wants relationship. He wants fellowship. He doesn't want us and our things. He just wants us. And we'll see where he goes with that. I don't know. I am looking forward to reading this, and as you saw, there are already some things that I agree with him on, but there's some things, they concern me. And I'd like to express them, not only for myself, but for other people who are thinking of those things. I don't want to be attached to the world, and I don't think other people should be attached to the world. Sure, we're in it, but we're not of it. But I'm tired. I'm just rambling now. I probably won't be doing these while walking around anymore. In the last one, as you may have noticed, passed by a few street signs. Didn't really want people to know where I am. I mean, it's not a huge secret, but I'd still rather have my privacy. This is Seth. This has been a thorn in my side. I just realized it looks like me shooting myself in the head when I did it that way. It's here. Bye.